you all for joining us. Before we formally get started, what I'd like to do is to take a few seconds to thank the committee members who worked so hard to develop today's program. I believe there's a slide with the committee members' names on it. Is that correct? So rather than read all of their names, we thought we would acknowledge them by putting them up on the slide so that you can see who these members of the committee were. And also, before we get started, let's look at a couple of housekeeping items. We invite you to turn your cameras on in order to make it easier to engage, as well as we are going to ask you to use the chat feature if you have any questions or comments, as well as turning on your mic when prompted to do so, as we have an opportunity for some discussions towards the end of the program. Please be respectful of others' opinions. And also be aware that this town hall is being recorded for educational purposes.
So, although this is not a new occurrence, the pandemic and the anti-Asian rhetoric around the pandemic have once again ignited hate and violence towards the Asian community. As members of the CUNY family, we believe that it is important to have today's town hall and provide a space for the LaGuardia community to have a discussion and provide support to those who have and continue to be affected by this issue.
We have a short video, a news clip rather, that we're going to be posting for you to view.
But Joyce, before that, let us do the brief moment of silence for those that have been affected.
I apologize. Yes, we wanted to take a moment of silence to remember those who have been affected by the acts of violence and hate. Thank you.
So I'm trying to do technology all at the same time, makes it harder. Alrighty, so we have today we are here to address acts of violence and hate that we have recently witnessed and experienced in the news since the pandemic. Here is a news clip that will help set the tone and focus for our conversation this afternoon.
Next guest is conducting an urgent study on the effects of xenophobia and how is the Asian American community reacting to the troubling surge of racially motivated violence? Well, the findings are simply staggering. Researchers asked nearly 700 Asian Americans about the types of hate crimes they've experienced since the start of the pandemic. 34% say they have been victims of verbal abuse. 24% cite workplace discrimination. 16% say they were coughed on or spit at. And 12 say they were assaulted physically. To discuss these numbers, let's bring in one of the co-authors of that study, NYU Associate Professor Dr. Doris Chang. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Chang, clearly there is fear and anxiety and people are suffering in silence. And you're a practicing clinical psychologist. What are the best ways to cope with this sort of collective stress and tension?
So there is power in our stories. So first of all, talk about what you're feeling and what you're going through, whether it's picking up the phone or posting on social media or filing a formal report. Know that by sharing your stories, you are actually helping others to feel less alone and giving us a better sense of the scope of the problem. Secondly, let's draw strength from our cultural communities. Let's reclaim what is good and beautiful and meaningful about our cultures, because being proud of who we are is actually a radical act of resistance. And then third, for those of us who are still struggling, having significant levels of distress, having a difficult time at work or functioning in school, please seek help. Please seek professional mental health support. Don't suffer in silence. There is help available.
And yet we should note that there is so much diversity within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, not just ethnically or culturally, but also geographically. We're spread out all over the country, which makes solidarity that much harder. Where are the solutions going forward?
Well, I do think social media has emerged as a powerful platform. We are reaching across with our posts sharing our stories, connecting across geographical divides. But it is important to recognize that there is tremendous diversity. Not everyone is having a single experience in this moment. And so actually hearing about some of those differences and how we're meeting this moment is a really important part of us building solidarity.
And we all know these events are prompting important and difficult conversations about racial reckoning. So how do we honor the struggle, for example, of the African American community while leaving space to talk about the pain in the Asian American community?
Well, I think that we have to recognize that whether racism is directed towards Black communities or Asian communities or other communities, that racism stems from the same root cause. So I think we first need to begin by educating ourselves about our own racial histories in the US and how this current wave of anti-Asian violence and discrimination fits into a larger historical pattern. And then secondly, we need to be actively strengthening our coalitions, our networks of community support, building allyship communities with Black and Brown communities and white allies as well, so that we can collectively fight to dismantle the roots of racism in our country.
The best way to fight racism is with solidarity. Thank you so much, Doris Chang. Appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you.
As Dr. Chang stated, whether racism is directed towards the Black or Asian communities, we have to recognize that racism stems from the same root cause. With that said, I would like to start the conversation with my co-facilitator, Joyce Moy, to briefly discuss the history of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence, the root cause, and what connects us.
Thank you, James. We have some slides that we're going to put up just to make it easier for you to follow. However, as was mentioned, the story of hate and violence, discrimination, scapegoating of Asians is one that has a long history in the United States. It's not something that is brand new. But let me first talk about who is Asian in America. Next slide, please. So in terms of how the US Census defines Asians, they talk in terms of those from the Far East. This would include Chinese, Japanese, and Korean populations. Southeast Asia, which would include the Philippine Islands, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, and so on. The Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and then other areas that are not specified where folks would be defined or designated primarily as South Asian, such as the people from Nepal and Bhutan or Sri Lanka. So again, this is how the US Census defines Asians. It's not necessarily how Asians are defined from an international perspective, such as folks from what's been referred to as Central Asia, such as Iran, for example. But this is the American definition of Asian Americans. Next slide, please. I want to start with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Fairly large numbers of Chinese began to appear in what later became known as the United States during the time of the Gold Rush, which ran from approximately 1848 or so to 1855. And some of these folks continued in and to remain in the United States. And over time, they helped to build the railroad, something that many people know about, and so on. The railroad was built and finished, completed, the East Coast and West Coast connected in 1869. Now, if you'll recall, a few years prior to that, the slaves in the United States were emancipated, and as a result, the freed slaves refused to work for nothing. Many of them also left the plantations in order to join families in other parts of the country. In an attempt to address the issue of the lack of labor on plantations, people talked about bringing in people who were of Chinese heritage to fill some of these slots. But in terms of replacing the African Americans who were now asserting their rights to be paid for the work they did, there was not tremendous success in that. As time went on, the railroad was built. People began to move from one part of the country to the other because transportation became much easier and so on. An economic difficulty really came about, and we wound up with a depression. There was a depression in 1873. And so as a result, the labor movement, who represented primarily people of European heritage, began to scapegoat the Chinese, saying that the Chinese were bringing down the wages and lowering working standards, making it difficult for the people of European heritage to make a living in the United States. Also, at the same time, we had the robber barons really pushing to eliminate and violently eliminate the labor movement in the United States. But the Chinese became the brunt of that scapegoating. And when you think about it, or if you know the facts, you would know that it was impossible for the Chinese to drive down wages to the extent that those stories were telling people. And the reason for that was there were 2 Chinese persons for every 100,000 other people in this area. But ultimately, that sense of driving down wages and so on, being different and undesirable, caused the Chinese Exclusion Act to be passed in 1882. That act said that no person of Chinese heritage could become a naturalized US citizen. By the way, that Exclusion Act also made it impossible for people of Indian heritage and people of Japanese heritage, for example, to become naturalized citizens. People of Filipino heritage and could not become citizens either until about 1946. And so this affected many other communities other than just the Chinese. In 1898, there was a US-born Chinese man who was denied citizenship. The birthright citizenship had already been established earlier, but they sought to state that this law did not apply to people of Chinese heritage. The Chinese community fought this case all the way up to the US Supreme Court, and that established that all persons born in the United States are citizens. It made it very, very clear. So people of Irish, Italian, Greek, German, whatever your background is, you owe the established principle that if you are born in the US, you are a citizen to this particular Supreme Court case. We saw other things play out as time went on. Fast forward now to 1942, World War II, the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Americans in this country, 66% of whom were US citizens, were rounded up and put into internment camps. This experience of oppression and discrimination ultimately led to many prominent Japanese Americans supporting the civil rights movement of African Americans because they began to see and understand oppression in a way that came out of their own experience. There were also a lot of interracial encounters and relationships that were built between the African American and Japanese American community during this time. The NAACP had sent visitors to the internment camps to look at the conditions, and they came back and wrote articles about how the conditions were so deplorable. They were so hot. They were out in the desert, essentially. And they talked about how people died from the heat, the elderly and babies died. And the African Americans spoke out against this injustice during that period of time. And at the same time, one of the most decorated, or actually the most decorated American military battalion made up exclusively of Japanese Americans fought valiantly for this country. It is the most decorated, most heroically recognized unit in military history up until today, while their mothers, their fathers, their wives were imprisoned in these internment camps. Next slide, please. Another milestone as far as Asian American history is concerned in this country was the murder of Vincent Chin. And this happened in 1982. A 27-year-old Chinese American man was out celebrating his upcoming wedding. Because again, we were in a period of economic difficulty in this country, many American auto workers lost their jobs. They mistook this Chinese American man for Japanese and beat him to death, blaming him for the loss of automotive jobs, when in fact it was the failure of American leadership, as it often is, that caused Asian Americans to be scapegoated. American industrial leadership did not keep us, America, competitive, and as a result, Americans lost jobs. But what made this act even more heinous was the way that the system treated the killers. The killers were fined $3,000 each, and they served 0 prison time. It causes you to ask, what is an Asian life worth when you see something like this? After 9/11, there was tremendous anti-Muslim sentiment that arose, and then the subsequent ban and the rhetoric of the last administration, presidential administration, caused serious physical attacks and killings of Muslims and South Asians, such as the Sikh Indian population, who were often mistaken for Muslims. And this continues today. Next slide, please. In terms of current acts of violence, just a quick overview, there's been a 1,900% increase in hate crimes against Asians since 2019, according to the NYPD. You'll see the source of that statistics below. Nearly 4,000 incidents have been reported around the country to an organization called Stop Asian Hate. The majority of the attacks, as most of you have noticed, are against the elderly and women, the heart of our community. There were 6 Asian women that were killed in Atlanta. The killer in that case said that he killed people because of his inability to control his temptations. You can imagine that. And these women were characterized and painted as sex workers nationally, when in fact, that is not the case. There was a recent killing also in a FedEx facility in Indianapolis, where 4 members of the Sikh Indian community were killed. And you can't tell someone from any of these communities that it is not connected to the violence and hate against Asians. Perhaps the specific words that are needed to prove hate crimes have not been recorded or were not overheard, but our communities feel that these acts are based on the hate and vitriol that's been targeting Asians. When I talk about this, I want you to think about what has happened to other communities. Many of us have walked along the same part of the path in becoming American. If you knew, for example, that the Italians that were lynched in New Orleans, and the comment that was made by Teddy Roosevelt, who later became president, said that it was good. If you know that they were treated as subhumans, if you know that there were other groups that were treated the same way, would you not begin to think that perhaps we have to stand up for one another? Would you not begin then to think perhaps that Black Lives Matter, because your community also was targeted? And this goes for many other communities as well. And so there is a common thread here. We're often pitted one against the other, but that is in fact the root of all of this, that systemic racism that has been developed over history as a way of keeping us apart, as opposed to having us work in solidarity to lift all of us. And so hopefully that's given you a little bit of a background, and the current demonization of China is not helping with respect to what's going on. So we want to try to address these issues, as the pandemic has really sparked and increased anti-Asian bigotry. We have with us Professor, go ahead, Professor Ting Tao, who is going to do a presentation about the Wounded Storyteller as a way of helping us heal.
Oh, hi. Good afternoon. I'm Ting Man, and I'm going to talk about the Wounded Storyteller concept, which hopefully can help us a little bit in terms of healing. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we hear many stories of anti-Asian hate and violence from people we know, social media, and of course, news reports. Why do we have to tell these stories when we fall victim to bias incidents or hate crimes ourselves? And as audience, why do we have to listen to those stories when we are already overwhelmed by the pandemic ourselves? The Wounded Storyteller concept proposed by Arthur Frank in the medical humanities field may offer some answers to these questions. Frank believes that when we suffer, when we are ill, when we are in pain, we need the thoughts of other people to assure us that we are not alone. We need other people's thoughts in order to fully aware of our own thoughts. In short, suffering needs stories. To tell our own story, we need other people's stories. Arthur Frank defines the wounded storyteller as, quote, anyone who has suffered and lived to tell the tale. Suffering does not magically disappear when the tale is told, but the more stories we hear, the less space our own suffering seems to take up. We feel less lonely. And that's how storytelling may help with our healing process. Applying the wounded storyteller concept to us at this moment, I can say that since the pandemic has affected every one of us, we are all wounded storytellers, although our wounds may not be necessarily the same. So let's hear a fellow LaGuardia student's story and see how we can support this storyteller. James, could you show the slide? Thank you. And Tomonari, could you introduce our reader of the story?
Okay, Therese, are you here?
Yes.
Okay, so Therese Goodman is a LaGuardia student majoring in Japan studies, and she's currently the president of the Japan Club. As a Black American woman, she empathizes with the difficulties that Asian and Asian American communities face in the recent rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and violences. She would like to read this passage written by a fellow LaGuardia student of Chinese origin. The student wrote about his experience of bias incident in Flushing. Therese.
As a student, I paid a lot of attention to COVID-19 since it first broke out in China and spread like fire throughout the world. Since COVID-19 killed countless thousands of lives, hate crime has rapidly increased in American society. New York City, as one of the most open and inclusive international cities, also turned out to be a place where discrimination is high. Many Asian people have been scapegoated for the pandemic, and some of them have even been hurt, according to the NYPD. I did not believe what the NYPD reported was true until I experienced it myself. In early May 2020, a white woman and a young kid passed by me on Main Street, Flushing, and she hit me on the chest with her left hand. She acted as if nothing had happened and kept walking with her kid next to her. There was not even an apology or a look back. I did not file any report out of shock and confusion. This incident made me rethink how to treat biased people like that lady and begin to doubt the American spirit. Compared with the damages of this unprecedented crisis has brought to the entire world, its impact on me might be insignificant because I know there are thousands of medical staff risking their lives to save people's lives, and there are thousands of police officers keeping order on the streets. Thinking about this, I believe that someday we will conquer the pandemic through the efforts of all humankind. Inspired by the selfless heroism of those working on the front lines, I'm more determined than ever to pursue my major in criminal justice. I really want to serve the community I love as a law enforcement officer.
Thank you so much, Therese. Thank you. Good reading. In the Wounded Storyteller concept, telling and listening to stories about suffering are equally important in the process of healing. So thank you all for listening to this story. For the next 3 minutes, I'd like to invite all of you here in this town hall to write a short message to respond to the author in Padlet or in chat. The prompt is here. How does his story make you feel? What does it make you think about? Is there a thought or feeling you'd like to share with your fellow students? I will gather your message and forward them to the student. You will now have about 3 minutes or chat. Tomonori, could you show us how to write our responses in Padlet using the link? Thank you so much.
So I just shared the link in the chat. If you click on it, you should go to Padlet. And when you go there, you should see a tiny plus mark at the right bottom. That's where you should click to post a new message. And then everything else should be straightforward. You can just share your feelings and your response over there. Or you can use the chat if you're not comfortable using Padlet.
So feel free to write your responses either in chat or in Padlet. You will have 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you so much. James, could you show the Padlet? Thank you. We still have like 30 seconds if you want to put your thought there. But to take your time, I'm going to collect them and forward that to the students who wrote the story. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tingman, for bringing this concept to us, and thank you, students, for adding to the Padlet. Please continue to add to it. We're going to move on to our next session. Our next section. Studies suggest that poor mental health among racial minorities is closely linked with their negative experiences related to racism. Stacey Chan from the Wellness Center will be talking to us about more about race-related stress and healing.
Thanks so much, James. And thank you to Andrew and Rachel, Evelyn, and some others who had their cameras on. It's really nice to see people's faces. Thanks for the wave, Evelyn. If anyone else feels comfortable, hi Frank, I see you there. If anyone else, hey Andrew, anyone else feels comfortable turning on your camera, it's just really great to see who's here on the call today so that we can feel a little more connected. Although I also respect those of you who don't want to turn your camera on. Hi, Angela, nice to see you. Chris and Sable. So as you feel comfortable, hi Vanessa, as you feel comfortable, feel free to turn your cameras on. I really want to help facilitate a time of sharing. Before I go into the next section on talking a little bit about race-related stress and healing. So we just heard from Joyce some really important Asian American history, and it's so important to know the truth about history, right? In order to understand what's happening today. So often these parts of history are left out. So thank you, Joyce. And Ting Man also shared a really, and a wonderful reader, you shared a really important story from a fellow LaGuardia student. And his story is important, and your stories are important too. So I just want to give students a chance on this call right now to share, if you'd like to, about what your experience has been like during the pandemic, especially if you've encountered racism, and how LaGuardia can possibly support you more in this area. And you don't have to be Asian. You know, people from different backgrounds are welcome to share right now. Would anyone like to share? If you would, you can just click the raise hand option here on Zoom, and it'll just give you a moment to consider sharing something with us on the call. I know it can feel a little scary, but we have any brave souls who want to share a little bit about their experience with racism in the pandemic. And it can be either something that happened directly to you, or we also experience vicarious stress, right? Through watching something on the news, and even more so when something happened to a person who looks like us.
Stacey.
Yes, Kyoko.
Well, I'll just start so some of you can follow, but you know, if you know me, I'm a very brave woman, and I usually don't get scared very much. But after this, not pandemic actually, in the last month, I think, a couple months, I started to hear all these news about. I thought New York would be fine, very diverse place. And I started to hear about the California incidents in California. But I thought New York is not going to do such a thing. But I started hearing all these sad stories. And I think my age group and my sort of Asian women is one of the targets. And when I started hearing that, I really felt scared. And, you know, I usually don't go outside, but I started going to some shopping in Midtown. And I never felt this way, but I needed to cover myself in any way I should. So, you know, luckily everybody has to wear a mask. So I did that. And I put my sunglasses and I put my hat so that I will be sure that nobody sees my East Asian face. And I wanted to make sure to take my 6'1" son with me everywhere as my bodyguard. So, you know, I never had to do this, and I never felt as scared as that, you know, moment. And so when I'm thinking about it, because I'm a counselor and I usually listen to the student stories, but I needed to really process this with my colleagues. So luckily, you know, my colleagues here, LaGuardia, we talked about it. And so that's something all of us should do, students and faculty and staff. We think that we are handling well, but actually we're not. So this opportunity for everybody, and it's not just Asians. I'm sure my brothers and sisters in other groups, they felt this way. So I just wanted to share that with my friends.
Kyoko, thank you so much for sharing. And I'm seeing a response from Evelyn here in the chat, who says, when Kyoko first told me this story in an email, it made me cry. We have been colleagues for decades. Evelyn, thank you so much for sharing this with us and for your empathy and really caring about Kyoko and others. Kyoko, thank you for being so honest with us, even as a counselor and faculty member at LaGuardia, right? That you too, we too, right, are affected by the race-related stress that we've encountered in this past year. So thank you for sharing and for your honesty and for starting us out. Andrew, I see that your hand is raised.
Yeah, I'm Andrew. I'm a student at LaGuardia, going to a rad tech program. Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about this anti-Asian sentiment, because I've been experiencing a lot of the microaggressions growing up in Illinois. And the isolation is not new to me, because living in the countryside, it lets you see both sides. Especially, I moved to Chicago for college as well. That I don't know. It's hard for me to say succinctly. That's like being Asian. It's just not special at all. Because like I know like the model minority myth has been used to separate people, but my parents, who are like, they are pretty well off, my dad's a doctor, they love the model minority myth. They love it because it makes them feel special, even though historically it's people has been separated from everyone else, from Black, Latino, every other minority group. But they still hold on to that hope that if you have enough money that you can, you know, move out of Chinatown or be successful and, you know, be like my grandparents, live in the mountains with their backyard garden. And I don't want to believe that anymore, because everyone still suffer because of the systemic racism. Money can't save you from that. Like you can't feel safe with more money.
Andrew, thank you so much for bringing up the model minority myth. That's actually going to be in a part 2 session of this town hall, which will be in a couple of weeks. But it's just such an important concept to understand that it can divide people of color, right? And can be really dangerous. And Andrew, thank you so much for sharing and being brave to speak out on this call. Your example and Kyoko's example, and I think we all have examples in our lives of race-related stress, right? Race-related stress and trauma is real, and it affects mental and physical health. So that's a first step, is just acknowledging that experiences like Andrew's and Kyoko's are real, there are consequences, and we need paths toward healing. So one thing I'd like to talk about briefly today is emotional healing. And it's something that I don't hear about enough. There's such a need, right, for emotional healing around racism, because racism hurts, right? There's a lot of damage caused by racism. I've experienced racism, and I remember racist incidents from decades ago. I'm older than I look, but yeah, it stings and it hurts, and we need paths toward healing. So I don't know if you guys are like me, but I think a lot of us didn't grow up in homes where we really learned to express our feelings in a healthy way, where we didn't judge our feelings, right? And I just wanted to give us an opportunity to talk a little bit about the feelings that we end up needing to deal with as a result of racism. Because the first step is naming it out loud, and it feels better to name it together than to be left alone with these kind of feelings. So I just want to, in the interest of time, I just would like to ask you to post any feelings in the chat right now that you've experienced as a result of racism. And by the way, I see a lot of thank yous and appreciation for Andrew sharing in the chat here. So Andrew, make sure you get a chance to look at that.
Yeah, I see.
Not belonging, powerlessness, anger, frustration, despair, fear, sadness, anger again. Yes, that's a big one.
Yeah, try a long time trying to talk about this with my parents, because they're immigrants as well.
Yes.
From Taiwan, so they have I guess a very a proud image of being Asian, so that model minority just fits that narrative very succinctly, just to make their kids feel better. Hey, you're different, but you're cooler that way.
And yeah, I'm seeing more feelings being posted here in the chat too, Andrew and all, that feelings that we experience as a result of racism, right? Disappointment, frustration, insecurity, fear, sadness, yeah. Being dismissed, invisible, uncertainty, confusion, anxiety, rage, oppression, and shame. These are real feelings, and many of us have felt these things, right? And it's so important to name it without judgment, in safe spaces where we can feel understood and heard, validated, joined, like, yeah, I get it. I know what it's like. And we would like to, continue to have these spaces here at LaGuardia for students to just process these feelings. Because you know what, when feelings get bottled up inside, when we just distract, go on social media, not talk about it, that's when we start experiencing problems like depression and anxiety, because those feelings get all bottled up and they fester. They don't just go away. So thank you everyone who wrote something in the chat here and just helped us to name these feelings out loud so that we can just have a space where we can show compassion for one another and encourage compassion at LaGuardia, right? To realize that an encouraging word, like from Kyoko's friend, I think it was Evelyn before, when you provide an encouraging word to someone who's experienced racism, it makes a difference. You'd be surprised to know, and I see Kyoko nodding her head, just expressing care or support to someone, like, I'm sorry this happened to you. I feel so sad that this happened. You're important, you matter. These words are powerful, and they can help to heal people as they process experiences of racism. Another piece that I want to talk about today in the healing, that's part of the healing process, is making meaning out of our experiences. So in addition to processing our emotions, which can be talking about them or other forms of processing, like through the arts or through dance or some kind of movement practice. These are all ways of healing. I'd also like to talk about finding meaning in our experience. Because sometimes when bad things happen to us, including incidents of racism, we internalize negative messages about ourselves that are just not true. And I just would like to give you an opportunity again to reflect on your own experiences with racism and what are any messages that you internalized about yourselves as a result of racism. So I'll just give you a moment to consider that. And I invite you to write something brief in the chat. When I see Kyoko wrote, sometimes that is all people need, reaching out and ask how they're doing. So true, Kyoko. So each one of you on this call can make such a difference in a person's life simply by reaching out and asking how they're doing. Sigmund writes, internalize the message that I don't belong, like people who look like me are less deserving. Ideas that you're not enough, that you do not belong, right? And perhaps we're not seeing as many responses in the chat because actually these things are hard to say out loud or to acknowledge, right? So part of the damage, oh, here's another comment, withhold judgment, maybe it is not a pattern yet.
Stacy, can I share a thought?
Yes.
My camera.
Just find who's talking here.
No, I just.
Vanessa. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, I just wanted to share, a thought that I've been having. I think many of us who are members of the BIPOC community, we have been feeling a lot for our Asian friends and colleagues in all of this, because it brings up a lot. And if I can just share personally, one of my oldest friends is an Asian American woman who I went to high school with. And throughout this process, I have been checking in on her more and more and asking how she's been doing. And she's got two sons, one who's a year older than my son. And, for for a good while, she would hear me rant and rant about, you know, just the experiences of racism in this country and discrimination and my fear for my son, an African-American boy. And recently, as I was listening to her share her concerns for her sons with everything going on, I said to her, you know, I'm really sorry that now you're having to connect to the experience I've had with my son. And, you know, it wasn't meant as a statement of now you know what I'm going through, but it was more a sincere, I am really sorry that you're having to have this experience, because this is a woman, you know, her parents were immigrants, but she's lived in this country her whole life and has in some ways been untouched. I'm not going to say completely, but it's been very, it's shaken her. And I've been watching how this has really shaken her and her family. She's got an 80-year-old mom. So I just, you know, I just really want to just say that, you know, certainly other folks who have experienced more blatant forms of racism, Black people have experienced anti-Black racism for a long time. You know, we know what this feels like, and we feel for you. And, you know, if this is something that gets us all to sort of wake up a bit and realize that we really need to be working together in partnership to like really eradicate racism, and however it even appears here at the college, we need to be working together on this, because yes, we're all affected by this scourge, and yeah, we're stronger together, as someone typed in, and we have to be there for one another. So I just, you know, for all my colleagues, my Asian colleagues, I want you to know that I feel for you, and if I haven't reached out to you, Kyoko, you know, I'm thinking a lot about you, and I'm sorry you're having to have this experience because it's painful. But that's really what I want to say.
Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing and for really living out unity and solidarity. Thank you for your care. And you bring up such a good point that in this time, we need unity and to support one another. And we can relate even more so, I think, to one another because of some of what's happened over the past year. But so important that in the LaGuardia community that we can be supportive of one another and work together to fight racism, right? And to make sure everyone knows that they matter and that they have a voice. So yeah, I just wanted to just circle back just for a moment on, you know, the messages that we sometimes internalize as a result of racism. A lot of times it relates to shame. And unfortunately, when bad things happen to us, sometimes we internalize shame that we're bad or that we're less than, we don't belong or matter as much. And that's not true. These are lies, right? So I just want to say to each and every person on this call that you matter just as much as anyone else, and that you're a person of worth and value. And it doesn't matter what happened to you. That doesn't, I mean, it doesn't matter in a sense that your value hasn't changed, right? It's not shame on that I don't want you to feel badly about who you are, you know, not to internalize the shame, but put the shame back on the person who perpetrated racism, right? That person should feel shame. And so I just want to really speak those words of truth, you know, over each person on this call and every student, that your voice matters and you matter, and your life matters. So I'm just going to close out this part of the call today by mentioning a few resources, a few follow-up resources. You know, today I just touched on healing, right? It's such a huge topic. Race-related stress and trauma is such a big area to cover. And fortunately, it's getting more attention now. And people are able to seek out healing and be aware that healing resources are available. So I'd like to tell you about a follow-up event. It's part of Asian Heritage Celebration Month, which Professors Sumant and Anita on the call here, they're leading the committee for Asian American Heritage Month in the month of May. And there'll be an event on May 5th next week on coping with trauma and emotional anxiety. So we're, after this event today, we're going to send out information about various resources, including this event. Also, on a weekly basis, another counselor and I are leading an Asian American wellness group. This is part of Wellness Center services on campus. So you'll receive more information about that as well. We meet on Wednesdays at 2:30. And the Wellness Center also has other resources for students of all backgrounds. So I'm only highlighting that group because of the nature of today's event. But I just want you to know that the Wellness Center has many different workshops, groups, and individual counseling. If you would like to speak with a counselor around your own healing process, I really encourage you to do that. That help is available right here on campus, and you'll receive more information after this event on the Wellness Center. So next, I think Anita is going to speak to us next about activism and taking action.
Thank you, Stacy. And thank you to both Stacy and Tingman for those powerful activities, and to all of you who shared. So when we think of making change, we often think about rallies and protests, and the work activists do is extremely important. In addition, there are a number of things we can do here at LaGuardia in our everyday lives around these issues. So first, Kyoko and Vanessa already gave us some ideas, right? We can reach out to Asian American friends, classmates, neighbors, and to check on them and see how we can support them and what they may need, right? We can participate in bystander training, which we can give you the information of an organization that has those trainings, which will help you think about ways to respond when you see these acts of discrimination happening. You can get involved at LaGuardia in groups, right? There's clubs that are related to Asian American heritage, including the Japan Club, Nepal Club, Bangladeshi Students Association, Chinese Students Club. And if there's a club that you don't see that you think we need, you can also start your own club. Joining clubs, you don't have to be Asian American or you don't have to reflect those identities. You can just learn, right, about those cultures. The fourth thing is we have classes around Asian American studies. So we have English 204 is an Asian American literature course, but there's Asian American history courses and other courses that are related. And then lastly, I'm going to share some events, which you see the flyer posted here on the 5th and the 6th. Stacy already told us about the events around mental health and the event on the 5th. So on the 6th, we actually have the New York City Commissioner of Human Rights, Carmelyn Malalis, coming to speak to us about what's happening in our city and how the city government is responding to anti-Asian hate. So that's happening from 10:30 to 11:30. It would be great for you to come and support the program, since the commission is taking her time to come and talk about the issue. We also have later in that day 2 nonprofit organizations that'll be coming to talk about their work with Asian American communities. And we have a launch for the Asian American Voices Journal, which students, including some of them in this call, I think, have submitted their work and will be, the work is being published. We have a COVID-19 oral history project. And then there's some other events, including a teach-in, an anti-racist pedagogy teach-in on the 7th. And I am not a virus workshop on the 12th that's happening. So there are many events that you can come to, participate in the conversation, learn more, right, about what's currently happening, about the history of Asian Americans in the US, about different heritage communities. And finally, you can stay connected by joining our Facebook group. So the Asian Heritage Committee is on Facebook, and we're very lucky that Dr. Nagano is always posting related events. So not just about the celebration, but about all the things that are happening. Thank you all. Joyce?
We're turning it back over to James at this point. I did post a few resources in the chat for those that are interested in looking at it. And I believe too, James, it will be talking for a couple of seconds about if you're interested in learning more about the activism on the campus, please use the following link to sign up. I don't know if that was on the slide, or we'll put it.
Just add it to the chat. So if you're interested, please add in your information there so we can get in contact with you so we can continue working on programs such as this. So please access the link in the chat.
Great. So we're excited to share the information with you. We'll be having a part 2 of this program on Tuesday, May 11th at 2:15, and you can register on the link that's posted here on this flyer that was just put up. So we hope that you'll join us there as well. I must say that I have been, I think, very moved by the presentations and by the speakers and the students' participation in particular. These kinds of gatherings and support for one another truly, truly are helpful. And thank you so much for joining us. James, do you have any closing comments?
Yes, I would like to say I just put in the bit.ly link, so please use that link for part 2 of the town hall. I would also like to thank Joyce Moy, who graciously agreed to participate in this town hall and our second one. Joyce is very busy. In fact, I think Joyce has another conversation later on this evening regarding the acts of violence to the Asian community. Thank you to all the students, faculty, and staff who participated today. Thank you for those who were able to share your stories. Just remember, we are definitely stronger together. So let's continue to share those stories. Let's continue to be a support system to each other. Thank you once again for participating today. Take care.